Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Linux and open source news show. In this episode, we've got Valve building basically what is Proton, but for Android apps, based on Waydroid, which could really open the gates for a lot more stuff on Linux. We also have ZDNet arguing that maybe the Linux desktop is at 11% market share, which I don't think it is, but we'll talk about it. And we've got some really interesting stuff happening around the Linux kernel and various distros. So let's get started right after I tell you about our sponsor. This video is sponsored by SquareSpace. They are your all-in-one platform to create, publish, and manage your own website. They have really super easy tools to create your online presence, whether you know how to code or not. So they have what they call their blueprint system, which lets you pick from a variety of templates that are pre-built and will suit any type of website, whether you're looking for a simple blog, an online store, a video platform, whatever. All these templates are also optimized to give you solid SEO, and they even have a bunch of SEO tools that you need to make sure that your website doesn't end up in the last page of Google search results. On top of that, to go further, Squarespace has their own design engine to create your own pages. You can just drag and drop elements where you want them, and you can change the colors, the fonts, and just tweak the template however you want, or you can automate all of this. And once you have something you like, you can add extra features like creating your own online shop with a payment system that handles credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and more. You can even design your own logo from Squarespace and book your own domain name. So check out squarespace.com/TheLinuxExperiment or just click the link in the description and you'll get 10% off your first website or domain purchase. So, Valve is building their own version of Waydroid called Lepton, with a logo looking like a frog head with a little arc around it, like maybe an Atom's core or kernel or something. So everyone picked up on the fact that it might bring Android games to the platform, a lot of Android games being VR compatible to run on various already existing VR helmets. But I personally think that this would also help with running a lot of Android apps on the Steam frame and potentially on the Steam Deck and other devices as well. Valve also added support for Linux ARM and for Android to their Steam SDK in preparation for the launch of the Steam frame and the Lepton compatibility layer. Now, if certain comments around articles are to be believed, it looks like they've been testing some Android games specifically with Lepton, but not specific applications. So maybe they just want to support Android games and VR titles more than applications. But I feel that once the compatibility layer and the Android container is up and running, chances are you can run pretty much all you want that doesn't require a Google account, because I don't think they would ship a Google Apps image for Waydroid in their own version, licensing problems and all that. There was also a post on Twitter indicating that Walkabout Mini Golf will be the first Android game on Steam, and that owners of the game on Steam will have full access to it through its Android version without needing a separate purchase. So it seems like Valve will mostly be using this Android support to help developers put their games on the Steam frame without having to port them to another platform. Now we'll have to see if, first, this is only going to be available for the Steam frame, which is their only ARM-powered device, or if they will expand that to the Steam Deck, the Steam Machine, and general Linux. It is going to be open source, but it might be heavily dependent on Steam and the Steam SDK, so maybe it's just not going to run as a standalone thing, at least not immediately. It seems more focused on games and to help developers port their game to the Steam frame without having to rebuild their entire thing for Linux on ARM, but I think it would really open the gates to having apps being deployed from Steam. We already have that. They already have an app section on Steam that lets you install stuff from Steam itself. So it's not a long shot to imagine that they would be able to add stuff like streaming services, YouTube, and others on the Steam platform, so you could download them to your Steam frame to view content with a VR screen in front of you, just like you were at the movies, but it's actually just in your helmet. But maybe even having that on the Steam Deck, so it would become a pure handheld that also does a lot of other things than just gaming. Anyway, it is a very interesting project. It's based on Waydroid. We already have Waydroid, but in my experience, it's been really hit or miss. The performance wasn't really that good, maybe because I use an NVIDIA GPU in most cases. It just wasn't a great project in my experience in terms of the usability of it. So if Valve can do with it what they did with Proton, this really might opened the floodgates for a lot more stuff coming to Linux, and I will absolutely follow that very closely. Now, still on Valve, in a recent interview, they confirmed that they were behind the FEX or FEX project all along. They didn't just pick FEX to run games on the Steam frame, they actually were funding it all along. Pierre-Loup Griffet told The Verge that Valve believes game developers should not be wasting time porting games if there is a better way, in this case, the translation layer or emulator. And I know this is going to get a reaction from people who really want native Linux ports that don't rely on Proton, because what Pierre-Loup says here also applies to those types of games. So in 2016 and 2017, Valve began recruiting and funding FOSS projects to make Windows games run on ARM, on Linux, of course. The first prototypes of FEX were showcased in 2018, and Valve has paid its developer enough for a full-time job since. Valve actually convinced the developers to start the project and funded it after that. The goal for Valve was to make sure that you could run any game on any hardware, and they're saying ARM might have desktop chips in the PC world at some point, citing, of course, Apple as an example. Valve doesn't currently have a plan to push manufacturers to make specific ARM devices, they're just open to opportunities, and Pierre-Loup says that they need to make sure that their entire catalog runs well and is well supported before they launch any such initiative or even potentially make devices based on ARM chips themselves. He also says that the ARM version of SteamOS is the exact same system as the one running on x86 platforms, just with the packages for ARM and the required x86 to ARM translation layers, and the ARM versions of Proton. It is very interesting stuff because Proton was based on existing technologies. It was using Wine, DXVK, VKD3D, they retooled it, they repackaged it, they did a lot of work around it, but it was using existing stuff. It's the same thing with Lepton, where they picked Waydroid and are improving upon it. But for FEX, they basically just funded the entire project themselves, which means they just funded a full open source thing that can run on any other ARM device, not just their own, for their own needs in a long-term vision like 7, 8, 9 years in the future. That's pretty impressive, and while Valve and Steam might have problems with them being basically a monopoly on PC gaming, they're still doing a lot of stuff for Linux, and you can't really deny that. Now, Stephen Von Nichols, a major contributor to ZDNet, or ZDNet if you want to pronounce it more European-like, he has a theory about the Linux desktop market share, and he thinks it's actually closer to 11% than to the widely agreed upon 4%. Now, StatCounter currently only places Linux at 3.49% market share on PCs and desktops around the world, and at about 5% in the US. But there are plenty of other things that are unaccounted for in that data, notably the unknown OS line that is very high and can't really be anything other than mostly Linux, a little bit of BSD, and maybe a little bit of Windows users using tracker blockers. So Stephen feels that most of these 4.21% unknown operating systems are Linux, where the OS is probably hidden with a tracker blocker because StatCounter measures market share through web traffic, so a tracker blocker would prevent them from identifying the system as Linux. Now, it could also very well be 4% of Windows users just using tracker blockers, but as we all know, Windows users are probably less privacy-minded than Linux users. A lot of Linux users just went there for the privacy after Windows started gathering data, so I would also assume that a lot of those 4% are just Linux users in disguise. Stephen also adds in Chrome OS at 3.67%, which in my opinion you really should not add up, because yes, it is Linux based, but it's not really Linux, as in a free and open source freedesktop.org distro basically running mostly Linux apps. It is a Linux kernel with some proprietary stuff on top running mainly web apps. And also it's going away in a few years, so it's not like it's something we should count on. Still, adding all of that together, it is 11.37%, and it even goes up to 41.7% of the overall all devices, mobile plus desktop market share, if you count Android, which again, I would not count in there. It is not the same thing that you're trying to measure here. An Android user is not a Linux user in the sense of using Linux on your own PC. So obviously I don't agree with his way of counting here. I don't think we should be adding up Android to Linux's market share, because someone who uses Android has not picked Linux as the system. They're not using our free and open source desktops. They're not using Linux applications. Same thing with people running Chrome OS. They haven't picked Linux for the benefits of Linux. They just bought a pre-installed stuff with Chrome OS that doesn't really run Linux applications. They're not really turning into Linux desktop users in a lot of cases. They're not really helping, contributing, or even just facilitating the adoption. It's not necessarily that useful to the entire Linux ecosystem, apart from maybe having a bit more device drivers being developed for Linux, which I will not say is a bad thing, obviously. Still, I'm pretty sure that among those 4% unknown operating systems, a lot of them are Linux users. Linux users are more privacy-minded than Windows users or macOS users, so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those were just Linux distros with a big tracker blocker that just prevents StatCounter from counting this. There could be some Windows in there could be some BSD in there, but I'm sure it's mostly Linux. Now, the Linux kernel 6.18 was released last week, and it's a sizable update. First, there's better Linux gaming support and better utilities. There's a new driver for GPD handhelds to better monitor hardware and to better adjust performance on those. The ROG Ally and Xbox Ally and the Legion Go 2 from Lenovo also got fixes for suspend and resume. The DualSense controller, which is the PS5 controller, its audio jack should also now work properly on Linux as well. The Nouveau driver now uses the GSP firmware by default on Ampere and Turing architectures. There's a new driver for Mali GPUs as an initial first draft written in Rust. There's better support for the various NPUs found in Rockchip system-on-a-chips as well. And on top of that, there's the new sheaves feature in the kernel. This is something that adds per CPU caches, meaning each core can have its own memory pool to store the various tasks that they need to do, which should improve memory management and yield much better multitasking performance for everyone on Linux. Not just for big servers, specifically, yes, for big servers, but also for every other device, so that's cool. BcacheFS has now been entirely removed from the kernel as well, because it's externally maintained. Ext4 got some improvements alongside exFAT, Fuse, XFS, and BetterFS. There's also initial support for haptic touchpads, those touchpads that don't truly click but just vibrate instead. And there's some laptop model-specific tweaks to add support for various keys and sensors. In the kernel 6.18, code that is loaded dynamically can also now be verified for integrity before it runs. The audit subsystem now supports multiple Linux security modules enabled at the same time. The UDP protocol got 47% faster in some cases thanks to changes made to better resist DDoS attacks. The scheduler got improvements for better assigning tasks to various CPU cores, and there are plenty of other changes. As always, it's better performance, better hardware support, better security, all for free as long as your distro obviously passes on those updates to you. It looks like the Linux kernel 6.19 is going to be a major release in terms of GPU and graphics driver when it arrives, which is not right now because 6.18 was just released. A ton of stuff was merged in 6.19 this week, including support for the Color Pipeline API developed by AMD, Valve, Igalia, and others. This support is for AMD GPUs for now, but the Intel driver might also support it in 6.19. This will help with HDR support, with color accuracy, and generally all color-related workflows or even just viewing content. Older AMD GPUs are also being migrated to the AMD GPU driver instead of the older Radeon driver, meaning they will get Vulkan support and a much better driver as a whole. It's more stable, it's well-maintained, and it's likely more performant as well. New Intel integrated GPUs will also see support with the XC3 driver, and this also supports their built-in AI accelerators. The DRM Panic Blue Screen of Death for Linux is also now supported for Intel cards. Nova got support for newer NVIDIA GPUs as well. The Nouveau driver added compression support and larger page sizes, so this should give a solid boost to the performance of NVIDIA GPUs that don't use the official NVIDIA drivers. The GPU part of the Snapdragon X2 chips is now supported as well, and there are more Rust integrations in the Direct Rendering Manager, which will help build Rust drivers in the future. The Steam Deck also gained hardware temperature monitor support alongside plenty of other systems like Apple Silicon devices and a bunch of other PCs. So there's plenty of really cool stuff in 6.19, which will definitely help almost everyone that uses a GPU. So basically every single Linux user. That's cool. I feel like there's a fresh wind of hardware support blowing all over the Linux ecosystem, and I think that's really, really cool. Phoronix did another benchmark of the Nouveau plus NVK driver stack versus the proprietary, or at least the official NVIDIA driver, and it is an interesting one. This fast driver combo is still half of the actual performance of what NVIDIA offers, but there is some sizable progress to the tune of 20% better performance when you use the latest versions from Git compared to what you can find in Ubuntu 25.10, at least with an RTX 5080. That's interesting because 25.10 is not that old and the progress made since October is already massive. Now, there are areas where NVK and Nouveau are doing really well, like OpenCL benchmarks using RustICL or RusticCL, not sure how you pronounce it, although there are some big things to fix still in terms of latency here. In games and rendering benchmarks, generally the official NVIDIA drivers still have a huge edge. Sometimes the free and open source stack hits 70% of the NVIDIA driver's performance, but as a whole, it's still not really close. Still, these benchmarks are super interesting because it really indicates that this stack is getting better and better and really, really fast. And with image compression support and larger page sizes support for Nouveau, this is probably going to get a big boost as well when 6.19 releases. So this is really good news. I personally don't think I would use a driver that only gives me 50, 60, maybe up to 70% of the performance of another driver that I can install, but if it starts to be 90%, 95%, maybe even 80, 85, I'm gonna start thinking about just using what is in the kernel instead of adding an external module that sometimes breaks and is just not as compatible with everything we have on Linux. AlmaLinux is looking at other markets than the server, it seems. The distro, which started as a Red Hat Enterprise Linux clone but evolved into a Red Hat Enterprise Linux binary compatible distro instead, they're building a special interest group, basically a subdivision that focuses on a specific use case. And that SIG is focused on media and entertainment to support studios working with visual effects, animation, and post-production. The goal is to make AlmaLinux the choice to run media production for artists, for engineers, and for developers, with work done mainly on making sure that stuff like Nuke, Houdini, and Maya and all of that type of software works properly or works better than on other platforms and distros. They will also document various workstation and render farm builds to help standardize the hardware and the software stacks. Presumably, this also will open the door in the future to partnerships with hardware manufacturers, which could potentially pre-install AlmaLinux and guarantee a certain compatibility with a certain software. They will also publish compatibility guidelines for app developers to ensure that their stuff runs as well as it can on these workstations. And of course, this special interest group is looking for contributors to help with all of that. I think it's interesting stuff. I'm not sure that a professional distro, as in something really stable, built on RHEL or OpenSUSE, well, or just SUSE Linux and stuff like that, I don't think a distro such as this has ever really tried to focus specifically on that type of work. So that is kind of interesting. I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but it does open the door to some interesting possibilities, so I'll follow this closely as well. Now, another week, another Fedora proposal to replace some older elements of Linux. In this one, approved for Fedora 44, it seems like the old Linux kernel console, called FBCon for Frame Buffer Console, will be replaced by the newer KMSCon for Kernel Mode Setting Console, which is running in user space instead of running at the kernel level. The end goal is to deprecate the entire FBCon console and frame buffer device emulation as a whole in the kernel, at least in Fedora. Apparently, FBCon, the current solution, isn't really well maintained. For example, it lost scrolling support a while back, which is annoying for a terminal, and also it depends on FBdev emulation, and it still requires some user space utilities like Bash to be useful. So KMSCon feels like a better solution because it is based on newer kernel features, namely KMS. It has some better keyboard support with the ability to switch keyboard layouts in that kernel console, which is really useful, and it should also be more secure because it is not running at the kernel level. It should also render fonts much better, it can scroll, and if it crashes, it doesn't trigger an entire kernel panic like the old FBCon does. KMSCon might also end up supporting rotation and mouse and touchpads by the time Fedora 44 releases, which should make using it a bit easier as well. Now, Fedora will not completely remove FBCon for now, it's still going to be supported and present in the distro. Users can move back to FBCon if they prefer, and if KMSCon fails, it will actually fall back to FBCon, so there shouldn't be any loss of functionality. Fedora will also split the KMSCon package to remove a dependency on OpenGL and Mesa drivers, so devices that don't have access to that will still be able to run it. Now, it's the usual Fedora move. They take something old that no one really was thinking about touching and they replace it with something new, and they're just basically leading the way, and after a while, when they've done the testing, other distros tend to follow suit as well. Now, KMSCon is not a recent project. I think its first release dates back to 2012, so it's not like it's a brand new thing that will break everything, but yeah, it's the usual Fedora motto. They are leading edge, not necessarily bleeding edge, and I do like their approach and their model. Now, the OpenDocument Format standard, or ODF, has been updated. This is, if you don't know, the file format used in LibreOffice, OnlyOffice, and plenty of others. Supposedly, it is the official standard for NATO and the European Commission. Microsoft Office also implements ODF, although it doesn't default to it, and in my experience, it doesn't support it all that well. The new version of ODF comes for the format's 20th birthday, and it's not like it's a momentous event, because it's still pretty confidential whenever documents are shared. At least in my experience, I never worked at a single company that used ODF instead of Microsoft's formats. Still, the update improves support for assistive technologies, it also improves general formatting of documents, apparently it allows for better visually designed documents as well, and some additional features for data analysis and technical documentation are present. Of course, this new version of the standard remains compatible with older versions, so your documents aren't broken if you open them on a recent suite, and of course, it's just the specification of the format that has been updated. All Office suites that implement it will need to implement that new standard for those features to be available to users, so we'll see how long it takes and if it really changes anything. I honestly think ODF should be the default format because the Microsoft Office compatibility is what drags people back to Microsoft Office instead of being able to adopt LibreOffice, OnlyOffice, CollaboraOffice, or whatever else. If ODF was the standard, the only real problem will be sometimes adapting to a new UI, and I don't feel that the tabbed interface of LibreOffice or OnlyOffice's interface is really worse than what Microsoft Office offers in a lot of respects. So if ODF was actually the standard that people used, I think our Office suites will have much more of a shot, but of course that's not what happens in the real world. But in the real world, you can at least get a Linux PC from our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. You all have heard about Tuxedo Computers by now if you've listened to at least one episode of this show or watched any of my videos on YouTube. They are a hardware manufacturer that makes laptops and desktops that run with Linux pre-installed. They're based in Germany, but they ship to most countries in the world, and they're basically the only manufacturer that I rely upon these days to do anything. I run one of their laptops on their own Linux distro, I have one of their desktops for gaming, they have a huge amount of choice for laptops, for desktops, for keyboard layouts, for the parts inside. It's just fantastic, and they've even started upstreaming all of their work on all the additional little light bars, keyboard backlight control, and all of that stuff to the mainline Linux kernel, meaning you won't even need to add any of their repos to add support for those tiny little things. They're really cool. The link, as usual, is down in the description. Anyway, thank you all for listening to this video, or watching it if you weren't glued to your Subway Surfers on your phone. I don't know, maybe people do play that. Do they still play that? I don't care. You have plenty of links down in the description to support the channel, plenty of YouTube buttons that you should probably click if you like the channel, and in the meantime, I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!